December 1944. The fate of Western Europe balanced on the edge of collapse. Adolf Hitler had launched a desperate last gamble through the Ardennes forest, throwing Allied command into sudden chaos. While senior officers at Supreme Headquarters debated procedures and timelines, one American general made a different calculation. George S. Patton, Jr. believed that saving lives mattered more than permission, and action mattered more than protocol. What followed would divide opinion at the highest levels of command, and Winston Churchill's reaction would reveal how the Allies truly fought war in their darkest hour. In the early hours of December 16, 1944, at precisely 5:30 a.m., the Ardennes erupted in fire. More than 250,000 German troops, supported by over 1,000 tanks, smashed into American lines stretched across an 85-mile front. Allied intelligence had completely missed the buildup. 6 U.S. divisions suddenly faced the full weight of Hitler's final offensive in the West. The objective was clear: drive toward Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace. At Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force in Versailles, Major General Kenneth Strong walked into Dwight D. Eisenhower's office, pale and shaken. The German breakthrough was far larger than anticipated. Enemy forces had already penetrated 12 miles in some sectors. The U.S. 106th Infantry Division was being encircled. Most critically, the road junction at Bastogne lay directly in the path of advancing German armor. If the panzers reached the Meuse River, the entire Allied front risked collapse. Eisenhower listened in silence before giving a quiet order. They needed reserves. Patton had to be contacted. 200 miles south, at 3rd Army Headquarters in Nancy, France, George Patton was preparing his own offensive. His army, nearly 250,000 men strong, was positioned to strike into Germany's Saar region. The attack was scheduled for December 19th, but that morning, Patton's intelligence officer brought disturbing intercepts. German radio traffic had surged dramatically. This was no limited counterattack. It was a full-scale offensive aimed deep into Allied territory. Patton studied the map for less than a minute. Then he made his decision. This was the real fight. Without waiting for instructions, he told his staff to prepare options for moving north. His chief of staff reminded him that 3rd Army was committed to the Saar operation and only days from launch. Patton cut him off. The Saar could wait. Lives could not. He demanded full movement plans within 2 hours. What happened next would become one of the most controversial decisions of the war. Before Eisenhower even convened a meeting to determine Allied response, Patton began quietly alerting his corps commanders. He ordered them to prepare to pivot their entire formations 90 degrees on 12 hours' notice. It was an extraordinary instruction, moving tens of thousands of men, vehicles, and supplies sideways across winter roads under combat conditions bordered on the impossible. But Patton did not ask whether it was difficult. He asked whether it was necessary. Most importantly, Patton told them to keep the preparations quiet. No formal channels, no written authorization, just readiness. That single decision placed him on dangerous ground. Patton was now preparing to redirect major combat forces without approval from Supreme Headquarters. It was technically insubordination, but Patton believed waiting would cost lives, and he refused to wait. Later that afternoon, Eisenhower finally called. A meeting was scheduled at Verdun the next morning to assess the crisis. Patton calmly told him he would attend. Then, almost casually, he added that he could have 3 divisions moving north within 48 hours and attacking within 72. Eisenhower was stunned. Such a movement defied doctrine, logistics, and experience. Patton simply stated that he could do it. When the call ended, Patton turned to his staff and ordered preliminary movement actions to begin immediately. Supply dumps were shifted. Traffic routes were planned. Artillery and communications were recalculated. Officially, nothing had moved. In reality, the machinery of an entire army was already turning north. By nightfall, elements of Third Army were repositioning. At Allied headquarters, the situation continued to deteriorate. The 106th Division had been shattered. German forces had taken Saint-Vith. Bastogne was under threat, with the 101st Airborne Division racing to hold it against encirclement. In London, Winston Churchill received his first grim briefings on what would soon be called the Battle of the Bulge. On December 17th, Churchill read the reports from his bedroom at Downing Street. The scale of the German attack was staggering. Concerns were raised about American command cohesion and the speed of Allied response. Churchill listened, silent and thoughtful. He had seen moments like this before, moments where hesitation could doom entire armies. Then another message crossed his desk. A British liaison officer reported that General Patton had begun repositioning Third Army elements northward without formal authorization. Churchill read the report twice. Then he smiled. He understood immediately what was happening. Patton was not waiting because waiting would kill men. He was acting because the battlefield demanded it. Churchill recognized a mindset he knew well, the willingness to move before permission arrived, because time was the enemy. The next day, Allied commanders gathered at Verdun, chosen deliberately for its symbolism. The room was cold. The mood was worse. Eisenhower, Bradley, and Hodges looked worn down by exhaustion and pressure. Patton arrived smiling, relaxed, and confident, as if walking into a routine briefing rather than a crisis threatening the war effort. As discussions dragged on, timelines were proposed that stretched into weeks. Patton waited, then spoke plainly. He could attack in 3 days. The room froze. Eisenhower challenged him, listing every reason it could not be done. Patton calmly replied that the preparations were already underway. In that moment, Patton effectively admitted he had acted without orders. Eisenhower stared at him in silence, then laughed. He recognized exactly what Patton had done, and why. Moments later, Eisenhower made it official. Third Army would attack north toward Bastogne. The timeline would be Patton's. As Patton left the room, the decision seemed settled, but the political storm was only beginning. Reports had already reached London, and Winston Churchill was about to decide whether Patton's initiative would be condemned or defended. As George Patton left the conference room at Verdun, the military decision had been made. Third Army would pivot north and strike toward Bastogne within 72 hours. But while the operational crisis appeared resolved, the political and command storm was only beginning. Patton had acted first and asked for approval later. That violated long-standing command protocol, and reports of his actions were already circulating beyond American headquarters. In London, Winston Churchill received confirmation that Patton had begun preparing movements before formal authorization from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. His principal military advisor, Field Marshal Alan Brooke, considered this deeply troubling. To him, Patton's behavior threatened discipline within the Allied command structure. If generals were allowed to act independently, the fragile unity of coalition warfare could unravel. Churchill listened carefully to Brooke's concerns. Then he asked a single question. Was Patton moving toward the enemy or away from them? When Brooke answered that Patton was advancing into the German threat, Churchill dismissed the objection immediately. For him, the direction mattered more than the paperwork. Churchill reminded Brooke of Britain's own darkest moments in 1940. When France collapsed and evacuation through Dunkirk became inevitable, Preparations began before formal orders were issued. Ships were repositioned quietly. Plans were made discreetly. And when the official decision came, the machinery was already in motion. Waiting for perfect authorization would have meant disaster. Churchill had praised initiative then, and he would not condemn it now. To Churchill, Patton's actions were not insubordination. They were preparation. He had assessed the threat, anticipated the necessary response, and ensured that when orders arrived, action would not be delayed. That distinction mattered. In Churchill's view, wars were not won by men who waited for permission while soldiers died. Churchill made his position clear. Britain would not object. Instead, he would support the decision publicly and politically. He ordered a message sent to Eisenhower expressing full confidence in American command decisions and specifically praising the aggressive response underway. That message was carefully worded, but its meaning was unmistakable. Patton's initiative had the backing of the British government. The effect at Allied headquarters was immediate. Eisenhower read Churchill's message and, for the first time since the German attack began, allowed himself a smile. Churchill's endorsement removed any possibility of formal discipline. With British political support firmly behind the decision, criticism of Patton's actions became impossible. Churchill did not stop there. The following day, he sent a separate message directly to President Franklin Roosevelt. He praised the speed and vigor of the American response and singled out Patton's rapid repositioning of Third Army as an example of tactical flexibility that wins campaigns. Roosevelt understood exactly what Churchill was doing. By praising Patton publicly, Churchill was providing political cover that would shield Eisenhower from internal dissent and protect Patton from critics on both sides of the Atlantic. Then Churchill took an even more unusual step. On December 20th, he sent a personal message to Patton himself, delivered directly to Third Army headquarters. The message was brief but powerful. It praised Patton's offensive spirit and urged him to strike hard. For Patton, the message carried enormous weight. Coming from the man who had stood alone against Hitler in Britain's darkest hour, it was validation at the highest level. Patton read the message multiple times before folding it carefully and placing it in his uniform pocket. He understood its significance. Churchill was not simply offering encouragement. He was signaling to the entire Allied command that bold action, even when it bent procedure, would be supported if it served the larger mission. With political backing secured, Patton's focus returned entirely to the battlefield. On the morning of December 22nd, exactly as promised, Third Army attacked north. 3 divisions moved forward through blizzard conditions, striking the southern flank of the German advance. The scale of the maneuver was unprecedented. In just 3 days, Patton's staff had redirected an entire Army Corps, repositioned supply depots, recalculated artillery fire plans, and reorganized communications across frozen roads clogged with traffic. Military historians would later describe the movement as one of the most impressive logistical achievements of the war. More than 100,000 vehicles were shifted under combat conditions, through ice, snow, and enemy interference. The Germans had not anticipated anything like it. At German 5th Panzer Army headquarters, reports of the attack were met with disbelief. Intelligence officers initially dismissed them as errors. Third Army, they insisted, was committed in the Saar region. It could not possibly appear on their southern flank within days. But, as confirmed reports arrived identifying the 4th Armored Division, there was no longer any doubt. This was Patton. No other Allied commander would attempt such a maneuver. The German offensive had relied on Allied confusion and slow response. Instead, they encountered immediate and violent counterattack. Patton's divisions advanced relentlessly, despite brutal weather, and heavy resistance. His method was simple and unforgiving. Constant pressure, no pauses, no hesitation. Patton personally visited forward units, pushing commanders to maintain momentum. When told a flanking maneuver would take hours, he ordered an immediate frontal attack instead. Losses were accepted, but delays were not. Every hour mattered. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded, freezing, short on ammunition, and under constant artillery fire. Time was the enemy. Inside Bastogne, conditions grew desperate. The division had been encircled since December 20th. Wounded men filled improvised aid stations. Supplies dwindled rapidly. On December 22nd, German commanders sent a surrender ultimatum. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's response, "Nuts," would become legendary. But privately, even he knew the defenders could not hold indefinitely. Patton knew the timeline. He had calculated it from the beginning. Every decision he had made, every unauthorized preparation, every logistical shortcut had been aimed at buying time for those men. And now, with Third Army closing in, the gamble was reaching its climax. On Christmas Eve, elements of 4th Armored Division broke through German lines just miles from Bastogne. Fighting was fierce and chaotic, but the advance continued. Late that evening, the first American tanks reached the besieged town. The siege was broken. The decision Patton made days earlier to act without waiting had paid off. Bastogne held. Lives were saved. And the German offensive had been dealt a fatal blow. But the full consequences of that decision and the legacy it would leave behind were only beginning to take shape. The relief of Bastogne marked the turning point of the Battle of the Bulge. What began as Hitler's final gamble ended in failure, not because of weather or luck, but because the Allies responded faster than the Germans believed possible. At the center of that response stood one decision: Patton's refusal to wait. As Third Army expanded the corridor and continued pressing north, German momentum collapsed. Within weeks, the offensive was broken. American casualties were severe, but the cost would have been far greater had Bastogne fallen. The 101st Airborne held because help arrived when it mattered, and that help arrived because one commander acted before the paperwork caught up with reality. In the aftermath, debate followed. Some questioned whether Patton had overstepped his authority. Others asked whether such independence was dangerous in coalition warfare. But results spoke louder than theory. The siege was lifted. German plans were shattered. Thousands of American lives were saved. Eisenhower addressed the issue directly. In peacetime, Patton's actions might have warranted discipline. In war, they represented exactly the initiative commanders were expected to show. The lesson was clear. Preparation without permission was far less dangerous than hesitation with approval. Churchill made that lesson permanent. In Parliament, he defended the response openly. He rejected the idea that war could be fought by rigid procedure alone. He argued that commanders who wait for perfect authorization never win battles. Those who act decisively, even at risk, change outcomes. His words removed all doubt about where history would stand. German commanders later confirmed it. They had expected confusion and delay. Instead, they faced a full American army attacking their flank within days. That moment, they admitted, ended any realistic hope of reaching Antwerp. The offensive died when Patton turned north. The legacy of Bastogne was not just tactical. It reshaped how leadership was judged. Initiative mattered more than formality. Results outweighed protocol. Commanders learned that decisive action, when aligned with strategic intent, would be defended, even if it bent the rules. Patton understood that legacy clearly. Of all the recognition he received during the war, Churchill's support meant the most. It affirmed a belief Patton had always held. Wars are won by those willing to act, not those waiting to be told. Years later, Churchill summed it up simply. Patton was flawed, difficult, and controversial. But when lives hung in the balance, he did not hesitate. In war, that quality outweighed every rule. The Battle of the Bulge ended. Germany surrendered months later. But the lesson remained. Sometimes the impossible is only impossible because no one has tried it yet. Patton tried. Churchill backed him, and together they altered the course of the war.